what I'm looking at here is the evolution of secret space programs. So who's responsible for the secrecy? Who can we point the finger at? Well, let me begin with this group of people that were brought out to the United States after the end of the Second World War, and a similar group of people were brought out to the Soviet Union at the time, and also others were brought to Britain after the end of the Second World War. Now, of course, these were scientists that worked for Nazi Germany in their advanced programs, aerospace programs during the Second World War. And these were obviously very talented people. But why would the victorious powers of in a war bring the scientists from a defeated power? I mean, when you think about it, it's counterintuitive. Why did that happen? What knowledge did these people carry with them that was of such interest to the United States, to Britain and the Soviet Union? Clearly these were people with exceptional skills that scientists in these other countries, the victorious Allied powers, thought they needed to understand or replicate the technologies that these scientists were working on during the Second World War. So this group was photographed in Fort Bliss, Texas in 1946. And of course we know that one of the pioneering programs that the Nazi scientists worked on during the Second World War were the V1, V2 rockets. They used that against Britain during the war, and they were fired from different locations in Germany and occupied Europe. Peenemünde was one location, and there you have some of the Nazi scientists that were involved. Werner von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and others that were really thinking that this would turn the tide of the war. Of course it didn't, but these advanced technologies were the things that the Nazi scientists were pioneers in, that they understood the principles far better than anyone else because they were the ones that made them operational during the war. No other Allied power had developed anything like the V1 or V2 rockets during the war. So these people definitely were experts in ballistic missile technology. And it operated on Newton's third law, that if you have, for every action there's an opposite or equal and opposite reaction. So with a rocket, as you expel gases at high velocity at the end of the rocket, then it propels forward very quickly. And so that's the principle that these Nazi scientists used in developing the V1, V2 rockets. Now, these scientists were more than just rocket experts. The scientists that were brought over to the United States, at least, some of them had knowledge of other principles, and I'll talk about some of the principles that they were experts in. Some of these scientists developed revolutionary propulsion systems that were not at all related to Newtonian physics, where you actually expel gases at a high velocity that propels a rocket forward. They operated on a non-Newtonian physics, or there was other principles that were being used for this. And here you have one of these wonder weapons that the Nazis were developing during the Second World War that was called the Bell. And there's been a lot of research done on exactly how this technology was developed secretly in Nazi Germany, and how the Nazis were trying desperately to weaponize this to win the war. They thought that this had a weapons application, and apparently they got very, very close. In addition to it having a weapons application, there was an anti-gravity aspect to it. So anti-gravity, well, what is that? In 1928, an American researcher, Thomas Townsend Brown, took out a patent in England, and the patent was a method of an apparatus or machine for producing force or motion. So basically he discovered that if you create a very huge electrostatic charge, that it can actually have a propulsive force that we think of electrostatics like lightning. A lightning storm is a very positive charge, a very large positive charge that kind of discharges and it hits the Earth. That's a lightning storm. So a capacitor works in the same way, and that's used in various technologies. But the principle is that you have a build-up of an electrostatic charge, a positive charge at one end, and then the build-up gets so big that it will discharge. Well, what Thomas Townsend Brown found out, if you have enough of a charge build up at one end and ensure that it doesn't discharge, that you actually have a propulsive force, that it actually has an anti-gravity effect. So that's what creates the lift. So that was the patent he took out in 1928. There was also another principle in this kind of non-Newtonian physics that was being developed by some of these Nazi scientists that were working on the Bell project, which used high rotating plasma in a ring. So if you send plasma, some sort of plasma, and circulate it very, very quickly in a ring path or a circular path around an object, it creates an anti-gravity effect. So typically, you're driving your car, the engine's spinning roughly 3,000 revolutions per minute, maybe 5,000, 6,000 if you're really got the throttle down and it's accelerating. But it was discovered that if you have rotating plasma at very high speeds, rotations at say 40,000, 50,000 revolutions per minute, you actually have a very significant anti-gravity effect. So these are some of the ideas and principles behind this kind of non-Newtonian physics that some of these Nazi scientists were specialists at, that were brought to the United States, to Britain and to the Soviet Union after the war. Now, one of these Nazi scientists was Professor Winifred Schumann, and he was the professor at the Technical University of Munich in electrophysics, and he had this expertise in high voltage electrostatics and rotating plasma. And that's his name there on this list of Nazi scientists that were taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio after the Second World War. So what we have here is evidence that not only were rocket scientists that had worked on the V1, V2 projects in Germany being brought to the United States to work on ballistic missile technologies for the United States. They were taken to places like Fort Bliss and Huntsville, Alabama. But you also had people such as Professor Schumann that had expertise in these areas of anti-gravity that I was talking about, such as the kind of anti-gravity effect by having high voltage electrostatics or having plasma spin around in a circular path very rapidly. People like Schumann were being taken to Dayton, Ohio to work on these projects. And see, here you have a document that substantiates that. So why was Schumann taken there? Obviously the Air Force were not working on rocket technology at Dayton, Ohio. They were working on anti-gravity technologies in Dayton, Ohio back in 1946. So we have really these Nazi scientists that had skills in different aspects of physics, the kind of Newtonian, traditional rocket propulsion physics, such as people like Werner von Braun, who became very popular around the world because he was instrumental in the NASA program, and they used conventional rocket technologies. And so that was what was used for NASA developing its rockets for space exploration. Von Braun and the other German scientists that were experts in rocket propulsion, they thought that rockets could be used to develop space stations, that you could send up these rockets with the equipment that could be assembled in space for putting together a space station. And so this was also part of a program that the Nazi scientists who had this expertise in rocketry thought was very possible. And so there you have, in 1952, von Braun coming up with a design of a space station that could be built using rocket technology. So there you have, back in 1952, already these scientists were saying rockets could be used to develop large space stations in orbit around the Earth. So were they developed? Well, you know, there's a lot of controversy over various things that have happened over the years in terms of the development of space stations. And one of the things that made it very clear that there had been a secret space program built or a secret space station built was a comment by President Ronald Reagan that he recorded in his diaries, presidential diaries, in 1985. This only came out in 2009, only 7 years ago, where he actually had written this down in his diary. And I'll just read it out, quote, "Lunch with 5 top space scientists. It was fascinating. Space truly is the last frontier, and some of the developments there in astronomy, etc., are like science fiction, except they are real. I learned that our shuttle capacity is such that we could orbit 300 people." So that was in 1985. So Ronald Reagan is talking about a space shuttle capacity that can have 300 people in orbit. Now that's a very interesting comment, because when you look at the space shuttle as it was in use at the time, it became operational in 1981. The maximum space shuttle crew was 9 people, and there were 3 levels where these 9 people could be positioned during the launch and the operations of the space shuttle. And so only 5 space shuttles became operational. So you do the math. 5 space shuttles, 9 people maximum. How could that possibly put 300 people in orbit at any one time? Not possible. So what was Reagan talking about? I think this is what he was talking about, that there had been a secret space station built that was part of a secret space program. That this is a concept, 1976, of a space station that would be serviced by these space shuttles. And there was far more than just the 5 space shuttles that were part of NASA, that the military had some of these space shuttles that were in use for this secret space program. So I think that's what Reagan was talking about in 1985. It would have to have been a series of space stations that had been secretly built and serviced by another space program to what NASA had put together. So we're talking about a second space program, a secret space program. NASA was the civilian public program. Then you had a secret space program that had things like this in space, where you could have 300 people in orbit. Now, how would you get that many people in orbit? Well, there was a whistleblower who came forward back in 1998, Edgar Fouché, who worked at Area 51 in Nevada. Who's been to Area 51? Has anyone driven up the extraterrestrial highway? Hands up. Just one. I've driven up there. It's a great drive, isn't it? And those fences are very intimidating, with use of deadly force is authorised if you step out in the wrong place. So definitely a very interesting place to visit. So he worked there. Edgar Fouché worked at Area 51 as a contractor on a number of classified programs. He wrote a book in 1998 called Alien Rapture, and attended the Laughlin UFO conference, where he revealed what he had learned about a secret space program that had been developed and was operating out of Area 51. And so he's got a lot of documents that substantiate that he actually did have the credentials to work on these very classified programs that the Air Force had been developing. So that's just one of his credentials, but there are a lot of them that are available on the internet. So what projects was he familiar with? Well, one that he was very aware of was the Aurora project, which is the replacement for the SR-71, the Blackbird, that became operational in the early 1960s, and I think its speed set a record. I think it was Mach 2.5 was the official speed record for an aircraft, and supposedly nothing's flown faster since. But many have suspected that there has been a secret spacecraft built to replace the Blackbird, the SR-71, and so Fouché revealed that you actually had this Aurora project that was the replacement for the SR-71, which was what the US Air Force used for its espionage of the Soviet Union and China, other parts of the communist world where they wanted to have their top secret craft or conduct their espionage. So this was the replacement for that. And what you have there is two craft, the SR-74 and the SR-75. The SR-75 is the larger craft, the one on the bottom. It's kind of like the mothership. And the SR-74, that's the smaller craft that rides piggyback. So once the SR-74 or the SR-75 reaches a certain speed and a certain velocity in the atmosphere, then the SR-74 takes off. The SR-75 can reach speeds, according to Fouché, speeds of Mach 5, and then the SR-74 can take off and reach orbital velocities so that it can be carried into the orbit and actually becomes a space vehicle. So this is one of the ways in which a secret space program can service these space stations that are orbiting the Earth, that are not publicly revealed, that you have the Aurora project providing the means to kind of fly equipment up there or fly personnel up there using very advanced aerospace principles. There's a lot behind it, but I wanted to jump into the TR-3B, which is really the program or the craft that Fouché really says is the kind of pinnacle. It sits at the apex of the secret space program, according to people that have worked at Area 51 that are in the know of what's being built there. They say that the TR-3B, which is that's how Fouché depicted it, that it has this capacity to circulate plasma at velocities of around 60,000 RPM in that circular ring there. So there you have 60,000 plasma, mercury plasma circulates in a ring, circular path in the midst of this triangular craft, which is about 600 feet across, equilateral, but they're not all that size. Some of them are smaller, but the biggest seem to be about 600 feet wide. And so plasma circulates there at 60,000 RPM at very high temperatures and pressure, as you said, 250,000 atmosphere, and that basically has a weight, a gravity effect, anti-gravity effect, where the weight of the craft is reduced by 97%. So if your weight was reduced by 97%, who saw John Carter of Mars? Remember John Carter of Mars? Okay. If your weight was reduced by 97%, you would be like John Carter when he arrived on Mars. Remember when he arrived on Mars, he'd just kind of take a step and he flies up into about 30 feet? You'd be like that. But you'd probably fly up 300 feet because your weight was reduced by 97%. And the laws of inertia, they still apply, but because your weight is only 3% of what it normally is, that means that you could do incredible turns very, very rapidly because of that. So basically, because of this anti-gravity effect produced by this rotating plasma, the propulsion system on this TR-3B is a nuclear rocket. And nuclear propulsion was something that was used very much in this secret space program, and I'll talk about some of the experts in nuclear propulsion and the role that they played in this secret space program. So with this weight reduction technology through plasma. That meant that these atomic rockets could propel that craft at incredible speeds. And this craft would also be able to do right-hand turns and so forth. So according to Fouché, this is the most advanced rocket or aerospace technology being built at Area 51. So in 1989, you had things like the Belgium UFO sightings where thousands of people saw these flying triangles, and they were recorded and photographed, and Air Force officers and planes were sent to intercept these, and they got them on radar. And so the Belgium Air Force were convinced that there was something very real in this phenomenon. And this is one of the photographs of that flying triangle from Belgium. According to Fouché, this is a TR-3B, or a locust. That was another project name given to it. So that was the TR-3B. And here's another shuttle, a smaller one, the XR-37. You probably have heard of this, being sent up from Vandenberg Air Force Base. It goes up there and circulates, or is in the orbit for about 2 years. They've been sending them up. So that's another one of these craft that can be used to service these space stations that have been secretly built up there. Because remember, if Reagan was right, and there's no reason why we would doubt Ronald Reagan, he was the president after all, and if he was told by 5 scientists that the United States had the capacity to have 300 people in orbit, then, and the space shuttle couldn't do that, then that is very clear evidence that there was a secret space station up there. And so these vehicles, the TR-3B, the SR-74, the X-37B, would be at least 3 ways in which they could get personnel or get equipment, resources up to this secret space station. So that is what is operating at Area 51, and the organisations in the United States that run that secret space program are the NRO, which stands for the National Reconnaissance Office, who is the organisation that is in charge of all the spy satellites in the United States. So they have been operating with the US Air Force in developing this secret space program and the space station up there. In fact, the NRO back in the 1960s first came up with the idea of a secret space station. It was called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. And even though it was announced in 1963 and then cancelled in 1969, after it was cancelled, something had been put in place to replace it. And so these are the organisations that run what I believe are these space stations up there that have been secretly put up there using some of the rocket principles and technologies that some of these Nazi scientists from the Second World War came to the United States with. So NASA has been used as a cover program for this US Air Force and the NRO secret space program. So NASA, of course, as we all know, had the 5 shuttles that were part of the space shuttle program. They are also an important part of the International Space Station. But that really is a cover program, because the most advanced technologies are not the rockets that were used for the NASA programs, the Saturn V, but what I revealed earlier, these vehicles like the TR-3B, like the Aurora, these are technologies that can get up into orbit and transfer a lot of equipment and resources without the public knowing. So NASA is a cover for this secret space program, but this secret space program is itself a cover for another program. So you might kind of get a little confused here. Well, how can that be? Well, in the United States and Australia too would have this similar principle, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that what happens regularly is that you use one classified program as a cover for another more highly classified program. Okay, so for example, what's happening at Area 51 is highly classified. And whistleblowers have come forward to talk about the things that have been going on there. People like Edgar Fouché, they've talked about the TR-3B as the most classified, the most advanced aerospace vehicle that has been developed in the United States. And nothing is as fast as the TR-3B, according to Edgar Fouché and a number of others. But, in fact, that is a cover program for an even more classified program. So say this is Area 51. All of the programs happening at Area 51, these are classified. I'm just using this to illustrate, but this is the using classified programs as covered for more highly classified programs. This is an NSA slide that was released by Edward Snowden. And so here you have all of the more highly classified programs that are hidden underneath this classified program. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So who really runs the secret space program, or the most secretive, the most advanced space program in the United States? So this is where it's going to get a little bumpy, because I'm going to introduce concepts and people and things that many of you maybe haven't heard of before. Everything up until now is pretty conventional and is easily proved by what public records are available. But what I'm going to get into now is much more secretive, but it's going to be an interesting ride, so fasten the seatbelts. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so who runs it? Well, it's the US Navy. The US Navy runs the most secretive space program in the United States. So one of the people that I've been working with recently, his name is William Tompkins. He disclosed a covert Navy program dating back to the Second World War, where he was part of a series of debriefings of Navy spies that had been embedded in Nazi Germany. And they had been embedded in the top aerospace companies, anything that would help the US in the war effort. The spies, their job was to bring this back to the United States, to the Naval Air Station in San Diego, where the program was run, and they were debriefed. And William Tompkins was part of the debriefings of these Navy spies, and he heard from them what the Nazis had been developing in Germany during the Second World War. So this was a program that was very real. Now, who is William Tompkins? Well, back in 1941, he was a very young man. He was only approximately 17, 18 at that time. And he had a photographic memory. And so he had toured the naval shipyards at Long Island, where the US fleet was based. And he, with his father, toured all these ships. And because he had a photographic memory and he had incredible ability to be able to design and replicate what he had seen, he came up with all of these boats, all of these model replicas of the Navy's boats. Now you think, well, that's a great thing. I mean, that's really a remarkable thing. Well, his detail was so accurate, so close, that eventually some of the models of his ships were being shown in department stores in Santa Monica, California. And some Navy intelligence officers saw these models and thought that someone had been spying on the Navy's top classified ships, because even though the ships themselves were known, the placement of radar and guns and the size and so forth, there was a lot of classified information about that. But Tompkins was so exact that he had made perfect models of what was there. So the spies, the Navy intelligence officers basically interrogated Tompkins' father. When they found out that the father wasn't a spy, then they found out that Tompkins had this precocious ability. So rather than lock him up, they decided to recruit him. The next best thing. Okay, you're going to be a Navy officer now, and you're going to join us. So that's what they did. They recruited him into the Navy's in the Navy service. And so because of these prodigious abilities he had, a photographic memory and ability to reproduce complex designs, he was involved in these debriefings of these Nazi spies that were coming back and talking about these technologies they had seen in Germany. And Tompkins was perfect for the job because he had a photographic memory, and these officers or these Navy spies would describe what they had seen in Germany. You know, a 30-foot circular craft with a dome top and with a gun placement here and there. And so Tompkins would hear all this and be part of the debriefing where he would ask these Navy spies exactly what was going on, what details they had seen. So then his job was to create briefing packets that he would then disseminate to others in the US aerospace industry. This is the mission orders that William Tompkins had, because Tompkins, unlike many whistleblowers, actually has documents substantiating his testimony. So he's got documents showing that he did exactly what he claims that he was doing during the Second World War. So here you have his mission orders as a disseminator of naval aircraft research and information. So his job was to actually carry information about aircraft research and designs to whoever in the US aerospace industry had the competence, the interest, and the expertise to understand these technologies and to be able to replicate them. Oops. So here you have a document that shows Tompkins being authorized by his superior, Rear Admiral Rico Botta. We'll talk about him later. Here you see he was authorized to leave the Naval Air Station San Diego. Naval Air Station San Diego, there's the date, 1944. So he was authorized to leave with a briefing package, with a package. So there it's one package. Here it's 3 packages. So here you have hard evidence that this man, William Tompkins, was carrying packets designed for aerospace technology that was going to be disseminated to various industries or aerospace programs that were in existence at the time in the United States during the war. So he said that he went to places like different think tanks, aerospace companies, any university that had an interest in these advanced aerospace principles, any one or any organization that could understand what the Nazis were doing. This is where Tompkins was taking these briefing packets to. So who was the admiral in charge of this? Admiral Rico Botta. His official job, he had 2 jobs. His official job was the Assembly and Repair Officer at Naval Air Station San Diego from 1942 to 1946. So that was his day job. In the evenings, he led a covert Navy program with 29 spies in Nazi Germany. That was what Tompkins was a part of. And Tompkins said in the 4 years that he was there were 1,200 debriefings of these Navy spies. There were 29 of them, and they came in and they would be debriefed over a course of a week. And then they'd go back to Germany, and then they'd come back the other week. And then you'd have another one coming the next week. And so this was going on. They were rotating them. So this was the person in charge of this program, Admiral Rico Botta. Here you have Senate approval of the retroactive promotion of Admiral Rico Botta. So here you have him being promoted from captain to rear admiral retroactively from 1943. So even though this occurred in 1946, officially he was a captain, but he was retroactively promoted to rear admiral because those were the duties he had at the time. So again, that's another document just substantiating the story that Tompkins has put out. So this is Tompkins' role in revealing what was happening in Nazi Germany. There's another whistleblower, Corey Good, and he has recently become very popular. How many of you have watched the Cosmic Disclosure series on Gaia TV? A few of you. Okay, well, the most recent one that just happened this week, Corey Good appeared with William Tompkins. And so Tompkins was being interviewed, and Good was asked, well, what do you think of the information that Tompkins has revealed? And he said, well, that's exactly what I read in this secret space program, in these smart glass pads. Good says that he was part of a secret space program from 1987 to 2007, that he served on that, and that there were these smart glass pads, similar to an iPad, but they were completely glass. And that from 1987, this is what was used in this secret space program. And there were a lot of files on this glass pad that he had access to, that he had need to know. And so he could look at this, and he read it. And what Corey Good said was that a lot of the information on those glass pads matched what Tompkins has revealed since. But Good actually went public before William Tompkins did. And so Good found Tompkins' testimony as corroboration for what he had himself independently revealed. So Corey Good, at the beginning of 2015, started to come out and talk about his involvement in this secret space program and what the Nazis had done in terms of developing advanced anti-gravity vehicles that were being secretly studied and reverse engineered, not only in the United States but in other countries. So he began saying that in early 2015, and William Tompkins came on the scene at the end of 2015. And when Corey Good heard William Tompkins' testimony, he said, well, this is exactly what I read on these smart glass pads. So Good's information was analysed using other whistleblower testimony and documents in a book that I authored and was released in September of last year. And I've got a few copies here, and so feel free to grab them, and I'll do autographing at the during the break and at the end of the last session. So my basic conclusion with Corey Good's information was that it's authentic and accurate. So what was it that he said? What was it that Corey Good said? That he says that he worked on this secret space program for 20 years, where they were operating in deep space with vehicles that were far more advanced than anything I've talked about so far. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Oh, and here you have William Tompkins' book, Selected by Extraterrestrials, which closely matches what Corey Good had revealed earlier. And so when Tompkins read this book, when Tompkins read my book, Insiders Reveal Secret Space Programs, Tompkins said, well, this is amazing. Someone else beat me to the punch. Because he didn't know that Corey Good had come out earlier to reveal very similar information to what William Tompkins has revealed. So what Corey Good says that he experienced or read on these smart glass pads, and what William Tompkins says that he heard in these debriefings of these 29 Navy spies, was that Nazi Germany had developed not one flying saucer, not two flying saucers, but actually had 30 prototypes, 30 different designs of flying saucer craft that used these anti-gravity principles, whether it was using electrostatics, high voltage electrostatics, or whether it was using rotating plasma, that the Nazis had developed many different prototypes to try to see which ones could be weaponized for the war, because the Nazis in Germany, at least, thought that these technologies could be used for the war effort. And so they were developing them furiously. And so you can see some of these craft have kind of weapons underneath. Some of these, the Nazis did try to weaponize some of these craft. So in Germany, the Nazis were trying to weaponize the flying saucers for the war effort. But that wasn't the only place that these German scientists were working on these flying saucer technologies. They were also working in another part of the world, and in Antarctica. This is again part of what William Tompkins and Corey Goode, and there have been many others that have said that Germany had established secret bases in Antarctica. So we know that in 1939 or 1938, 1939, that the Nazis did send an expedition to Antarctica with an aircraft carrier and a number of ships and support and aircraft to, allegedly map Antarctica, but in fact they went there to establish a presence in Antarctica. So there you have the Deutsche Antarctic expedition with some of the personnel there. Before I mention that, one of the things that was interesting about this expedition was that once it was launched, that the US actually authorized Admiral Richard Byrd. Some of you know about him from Operation High Jump. How many have heard of Operation High Jump? Okay, many of you know Admiral Byrd led that in 1946, 1947. Well, how many of you know that in 1939 he had been given orders by President Roosevelt to go to Antarctica to find the Nazi bases, and that he actually led an expedition? How many of you know that Admiral Byrd? Okay, so a few of you, not as many, but so Byrd went there in 1939 to find the Nazi bases. So that's historical fact. So the Nazis did establish a presence in Antarctica. Now, one of the interesting things about Antarctica is that there's been a lot of research on Antarctica, and that some believe that Antarctica was actually ice-free recently. That according to conventional science, geologists will tell you Antarctica is being buried under 2 miles of ice for millions of years. Well, according to maps that have been released in the 16th century, the Peri-Reis map, the Orontes-Phineas map, how many of you have heard of those maps? They show Antarctica ice-free in the 16th century. How can that be? Antarctica wasn't discovered until much later. How could they have known that Antarctica existed in the first place, and it actually showed Antarctica ice-free? That demonstrates that in our recent history, Antarctica was ice-free. So this is a map of Antarctica that shows that its present land territory under the ice. This was developed by a cartographer from National Geographic, and it shows that underneath the ice of Antarctica you have large areas of water, right? So what happens, you can look at the map of Antarctica as it exists today, ice covered, right? But underneath that you have these passages, the ice-free. I mean, those rivers or that inland ocean doesn't disappear, it's still there. It's under the ice. So what happened, according to Tompkins, Goode and others, was that the Nazis were given information for being able to access bases or build bases in these underground, using these underground passageways for their submarines. The Nazis, one area in the maritime warfare that the Nazis had a distinct advantage was their capacity to build submarines. They were building thousands of submarines during the war, and they gave directions for their submarine captains to be able to navigate these passageways under the Antarctic ice. So here you have a document that was released from a letter showing how these captains of the Nazi U-boats could navigate the passageways under the Antarctic ice to find the caverns, the bases, where the Nazis had moved equipment, resources, men, to be able to build aerospace technologies there, a secret space program. So this shows how the Nazis got to Antarctica, and what Tompkins could say is that from Antarctica, that's where the Nazis developed a space program. So I said it was going to be a wild ride. So here it is. The Nazis were the first people on the moon. I mean, it sounds incredible, but this is what these whistleblowers are claiming. That in the 1940s, while you had war raging in Europe, the Nazis had a secret space program operating out of Antarctica, and that Antarctic space program was successful in having people land on the moon. Incredible stuff, but this is the information they've been releasing. That not only were the Nazis successful in sending people to the moon in the 40s, but they also were successful in sending missions to Mars in the 40s. I mean, again, incredible information. Nothing that conventional historians have given us any clue has been happening. But this is what the whistleblowers are telling us. And as I said, these whistleblowers have a lot of, especially with William Tompkins, he's got documents showing that this information was actually known to the US Navy back in the 1940s. So the Navy knew about this. The Navy spies were reporting on what the Nazis were doing both in Europe for the war effort, but also in Antarctica. And William Tompkins, if you listen to any of his interviews, you know, he describes the human reaction of these spies, because these were young men, very bright men. You had to be bright to be a spy in Germany. Native-speaking German Americans that went there. And they came back and they were embarrassed because some of these spies said that they felt so embarrassed telling the admiral that the Nazis had developed these kinds of technologies, that the Nazis had a space program in Antarctica and that they were flying saucers craft to the moon. You know, that these spies were embarrassed by that because they thought it had to be nonsense, had to be propaganda. But the admiral, Rico Botta, you know, he basically wanted them to reveal accurately everything that they heard, and so this was the debriefing, and they were telling him these things were happening. So the US Navy back in the 1940s were learning from these Navy spies that the Germans had succeeded in developing a secret space program, transporting people and equipment to the moon, Mars and beyond. Incredible stuff, but that was what the Navy had learned back then. So then we have Operation High Jump, and I think most of you are familiar with that. That's the flagship the US Philippine Sea. And I think most of you have heard stories about the Navy aircraft being destroyed by German, the Navy aircraft were destroyed. According to the official records, these Navy aircraft were destroyed. There were accidental crashes and so forth. Some personnel were lost, and Admiral Byrd is well known to have described some of the casualties. He gave an interview for the El Mercurio newspaper in Chile and was quoted talking about having suffered casualties and also of a new enemy that could fly from pole to pole at an incredible speed. So here was Byrd honestly revealing, before arriving in the United States, where he must have known he would have been censored, honestly revealing to a journalist in Chile that the Navy had encountered a new enemy that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds, and that they had suffered significant casualties. Well, according to Tompkins and Byrd, what had happened was that Operation High Jump was attacked by 3 waves of these flying saucers that just flew out of the ocean. They flew out of the ocean because if you've built a craft that can operate in deep space, it can also operate under the ocean. It's, principles are the same. And so these flew out of the ocean and just destroyed all of the aircraft and destroyed a number of the ships. And then what was left of the task force limped back. Again, it's a bumpy ride. Many of you have heard of the 1952 Washington UFO flyover? Okay, about half of you. Very famous incident, 1952, thousands of people in Washington DC saw these flying saucers fly over the Capitol in successive weekends in July 1952. And these were recorded, there were photographs, radar trackings. They sent fighter pilots up there in their craft, in their jets to intercept, but they couldn't do anything. So this is well documented, and President Truman commented on it. There was the US Air Force did a press conference describing what had happened here. Basically trying to dismiss it as kind of swamp gas, but in fact, any of the witnesses that were there at the time were very clear that this was not swamp gas, that this was something else, that these were flying saucers. Well, according to William Tompkins, Corey Goode, and even another whistleblower, Clark McClelland, he was a spacecraft operator for NASA up until the 1990s. You probably know about Clark McClelland. He was a very famous UFO investigator from the United States. And he says the same thing as Corey Goode and Bill Tompkins, that these flying saucers flying over the Capitol clearly were not swamp gas, but they weren't extraterrestrial either. Most people assume that they were extraterrestrial, and certainly when I first heard about it, that was my assumption. But what they're saying, what they've said, is that these were not extraterrestrial at all. These were Nazi German flying saucers that the Nazis had recovered after the war sufficiently, where they now had built fleets of these saucers, and that they now were the dominant geopolitical power out of Antarctica and wherever else, the moon and whatever other planets that they had established a presence. So this incredible information, as I said, but you think of the implications of this. If this really was, these really were Nazi UFOs, right, flying over the Capitol, what would President Truman have told the American public? Sorry, we lied to you. Nazi Germany wasn't defeated after the war. They established a presence in Antarctica, and since then they've developed these incredible aerospace vehicles that can outperform anything that we have by quantum leaps. They have flying saucers. We don't. You couldn't imagine Truman or anyone else revealing that to their population. So it gives us another reason for why this was kept secret. Because there was great embarrassment. And certainly, why would Britain and the Soviet Union keep these technologies secret? Why would the Soviet Union keep it secret? I mean, most people make the assumption that, well, the oil industry, the pharmaceutical industry, they didn't want UFOs to be revealed because, you would stop making huge profits. And that this is what fuels the military-industrial complex in the United States. And that is a solid reason. But it doesn't explain why the Soviet Union would be quiet about it. Why would the Soviet Union be quiet about flying saucers and the development of these anti-gravity technologies? They had everything to gain from it. It was because the Soviets were embarrassed. The Nazis continued on, and they had technologies way more advanced than anything that the Soviets had and anything that the Americans had. So there was a conspiracy of silence by the Soviets and the Americans and the British. Deals were made between the Truman and Eisenhower administration and these Nazis that had their flying saucer program in Antarctica. They made deals. They made deals whereby the Nazis said that they weren't interested in exacting revenge on the Allied powers. They weren't interested in revenge. what they were interested in was forming agreements and cooperating, because the Nazis truly had become a space power. I mean, fancy that. Or maybe more accurately, we can describe them as German secret societies, because these were more than just Nazis, Nazi ideologues. They believed in the occult and esoteric communications with all sorts of entities, but they were not intent on planetary conquest, because they could have achieved that. But they knew that if they tried to conquer the United States militarily, or conquer the Soviet Union militarily, there would be great destruction, because the United States and the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. So there would be utter devastation. So what's the point? If you need those military resources, if you need those industrial resources to be able to develop, to expand your space program out of Antarctica by a factor of 10. So the Nazis, they had some estimates are like 3 million people in Antarctica at these secret bases. Sounds like a lot of people, but compare that to the United States at the time, or Europe at the time, hundreds of millions of people. Clearly, if you wanted to expand your space program, you needed to form an alliance with the US military industrial complex, and so the Nazis did. And there were many people in the US military industrial complex that were very happy to do so, because they had cooperated with the Nazis in the lead up to the Second World War, but that's another story. So, alliances were made with the US military-industrial complex to build, or to cooperate in building, advanced technologies that the Nazis could use to expand their space program in Antarctica. But at the same time, the Navy knew what was going on, and the Navy had its own agenda. It had its own plan for how to use this information that it had gained from the 1940s, from its espionage, and from whatever agreements had been reached with this breakaway group in Antarctica, that the US Navy had its own plans, and so one of these plans was to build their own space fleet using some of the ideas, and people like William Tompkins, because of his skill, were going to be playing a critical role in this. So from 1951 to 1963, Tompkins worked at Douglas Aviation Company, a think tank called Advanced Design, where UFOs and anti-gravity technologies were studied for a US Navy space program, these space battle fleets. Now, earlier on I talked about the US Air Force and the NRO building the TR-3B out of Area 51. Now, that's the thinking of the Air Force. You build squadrons of advanced craft that can be used for whatever you plan to do in space. But the Navy thinks in terms of battle groups. The Navy has a completely different way of conceptualizing how it's going to conduct itself in, whether it's the oceans or in deep space. They think in terms of battle groups. And these battle groups require building things similar to an aircraft carrier battle group, where you have like an aircraft carrier, you have your destroyers, cruisers, submarine escorts, and other support ships. So you have a kind of a battle group that's integrated, that can fulfill whatever the mission is for that battle group. So the Navy thought that is exactly what we need to do in deep space. We need to build these space battle groups. So the Navy began working in the 1950s in designing these space battle groups. And William Tompkins was part of this at a unit in this think tank in Douglas Aircraft Company. Douglas today has been merged with Boeing, so we don't know now. It's hard to kind of imagine how big a company Douglas was back in the day. But during the Second World War, just to give you an idea, Douglas Aircraft Company built 30,000 aircraft for the war. So this was a really big company. And this was the company that was set up. This was the company that created the RAND organization, which is a think tank in Santa Monica, Research and Design, which is one of the most secretive think tanks in the United States. But the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica grew out of this think tank in Douglas Aviation Company, the Douglas Aerospace Company. So William Tompkins worked for Douglas from 51 to 63. And so there's a document showing showing that Tompkins' two superiors at Douglas, Klemperer and Wheaton, Elmer Wheaton, these were his two bosses at Advanced Design at Douglas, and that they were working on anti-gravity technologies, that they were studying UFOs. So this is a document that Tompkins has provided substantiating that. So the Douglas Aircraft Company was in the 1950s working on anti-gravity technology. That document proves that. Tompkins says that he was at Douglas building or designing the first US Navy space battle groups. So this was one of them, one of the craft he designed back in 1954, a naval spacecraft battle cruiser. And here, it's hard to read that, it's not really legible, but he says that this is several kilometers in length. Kilometers, several kilometers. Now, earlier on I talked about the TR-3B, 600 feet wide, okay, that it operates out of Area 51. Well, this thing is several kilometers long. It's massive, and this is not built at Area 51. This is built somewhere else. So that was what Tompkins says he was designing on behalf of the Navy, or for the Navy, when he was working at Douglas Aerospace, or Douglas Aviation Company in the 50s. The Navy was designing these. There's a space carrier, 1954. That was a Navy request for a space carrier. What would a space carrier look like? They got Douglas to work on it, and Tompkins was working with Douglas because Tompkins understood the principles. He understood the principles of building of models of highly complex naval battle groups. And because of Tompkins had sat in on the debriefings of these Navy spies, he knew the principles that the Nazis had used in developing their own flying saucer programs. So that was 1954, Tompkins designing these space battle cruisers, or space carriers as well, for the Navy. It wasn't easy. There was Nazi industrial sabotage slowed the US Navy space program by decades. Okay, so Elmer Wheaton, this was the man that was Tompkins' boss at Douglas. It got so bad in terms of the industrial espionage, and the Nazis were involved in this, because as I said, the Nazis had reached agreements with the military-industrial complex, with the US military-industrial complex, and it was quite clear what their strategy was. Their strategy was to siphon off as much resources and innovative thinking and manpower as they could for their program that was operating out of Antarctica, and to sabotage what the US was doing to try and replicate what the Nazis had achieved in Antarctica. So the Nazis knew full well that this was what the Navy was trying to do, but they were sabotaging it. And so the person at Douglas Aircraft Company became so frustrated with the sabotage that was happening at Douglas, Elmer Wheaton, that he decided to resign, and he went over to Lockheed Skunk Works in 1962 and started to help them develop an anti-gravity space program. So he was a very important individual. And then Tompkins was a year later, less than a year later, sacked by Douglas. He was sacked by Douglas Aircraft Company, because the people in the manufacturing sector of Douglas had all the power, and Tompkins was part of the engineering division at Douglas Aircraft. And the engineering division were working on these innovative designs for the Navy, whereas the manufacturing sector were working on building rockets for the NASA space program. And so they said it was a waste of time to put resources and specialists into these kind of esoteric ideas that were happening in engineering, that they needed to work on manufacturing these rockets. And so there was a lot of politics, and this was sabotage because there were people in the manufacturing that were working secretly with the Nazis that wanted to sabotage what was happening in engineering, that were coming up with the designs for the Navy. This resulted in the first battle groups being deployed in the 1980s, and the date that we have from Bill Tompkins and Corey Good seems to be 1984, which is when these first battle groups were deployed, and ultimately there were 8 of them that were deployed. So that's just a one design, an artist's conception, but it's interesting. Again, the Naval Space Command, that's really who's in charge of this, the most advanced space program in the United States. And that also will, as we'll see soon, involve some other major powers that will be very interesting to you. So that began in 1984, and there were 8 of these space battle groups that were developed. So according to Bill Tompkins, it followed the kind of classic naval logic in terms of developing battle groups that they rotate. So like the United States has 10 aircraft carrier battle groups, but 5 are deployed at any one time, and then there are another 5 or so that are being serviced or upgraded with the latest technologies. So this is what they do with aircraft battle groups. It's the same principle with these space battle groups. You have 8, and 4 are in operation and deep space, and another 4 are being serviced either in their massive facilities in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah, which is near Salt Lake City. That's the largest military areas outside of Nevada is in Utah. So you've got 8 of these space battle groups. Now, one of the things that's going to be of interest is, well, if you've got these space battle groups operating out there and it's all hush-hush, how are you going to get people to man them? How are you going to get people to volunteer? Well, the technology that was used, and this goes back again, this is one of those things that's, as I said, a rough ride, a bumpy ride. The Nazis not only developed these incredible technologies, but they, for propulsion and developing deep space capabilities, but also age regression, being able to prolong human life. This was something that the Nazis had done some work with, and that the Navy had learned about through the debriefings. And according to William Tompkins, it wasn't until the late 60s that work was put into developing these ideas in terms of technology that could be used for age regression. So to be able to reverse a person's age, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever, sounds incredible, but this was something that dates back to the Nazi era, that even then, these ideas that they were holding, that they had. So by the late 1960s, Bill Tompkins says that he began working at a company, TRW, on age regression. That TRW is an aerospace company. It's been merged into Northrop Grumman, another major aerospace company today. But back in the day, one of its many projects was age regression. And Tompkins, that was one of his assignments when he was working at TRW from 1967 to 71. and that they had succeeded in developing these principles so that age could be physically reversed. So this is where we get into these secret space program whistleblowers who say that they have served 20-year tours of duty, and at the end of that 20 years they are reversed back in age and sent back in time. So time travel, again, this is a bumpy ride. Time travel is a part of this really complex story here. Age regression, time travel, this is part of how these secret space programs operate. You recruit personnel for 20-year tours of duty, and to be able to maintain morale, commitment, you tell people that are recruited that they're going to serve their 20 years, and then at the end of that, they're going to be sent back in time at the same age as when they began, that their age is going to be reversed, they're going to be sent back in time, and they can live that 20 years again. Which is a way to motivate people because they have nothing to lose, because you're going to actually have an extra 20 years of your life. So Corey Good, for example, I think he looks in his mid-40s, because that is what he is. I think he was born in, 1970? I think he was born 1970. And so he's now turned 46 this year. But because he was put through this age regression for 20 years, that means he's really 66. So those of you that have seen him in Cosmic Disclosure know that he does not look like 66. So this is a way to motivate people to sign up for this kind of program, that they can actually have an extra 20 years of life and then relive what they had experienced, then relive that 20 years in a normal civilian life. So the first whistleblower that came forward to talk about this was Michael Ralph, and some of you have probably heard of him because I believe Stephanie Ralph is an Australian. I think she comes from Queensland, from what I recall. Yeah, so she's a Queenslander, and she did the therapy sessions to help Michael Ralph regain his memories. And so here you have the timeline. He says at the beginning, that bottom timeline, at age 6 he has encounters with extraterrestrials, and that's a topic that I'll talk about on Sunday. I'm not talking about extraterrestrials now because that's really adding a really complex layer to this, a deeper layer. But so anyway, Michael Ralph says that he was exposed to these abductions. In 1976 he joins the Navy. He's recruited into the Navy's secret space program. That he then is sent to Mars by this jump gate technology. Begins a tour of duty. Then from 1976 to 1996 he's on Mars, serving for 20 years as a number of duties, but also as a space fighter pilot. Was one of these duties. At the end of these 20 years, he's age regressed, then he's sent back in time, and he then lives the 20 years again. 1976, he is at the beginning of his Navy service. He serves out another 6 years in the Navy to 82, gets an honourable discharge. Then he has clearing sessions with Stephanie Ralph in 1996, and 2001 he publishes the Mars records with his story. So he's one example of a whistleblower saying that they have done one of these 20-year and back programs. The second is Randy Kramer, and his story begins at age 5, that he gets recruited into this program. It's a military abduction program where at age 5 he serves for 12 years, or that he's in that program for about 12 years, and he's trained to be a super soldier, where he can do all of these incredible things as a super soldier through mind control and so forth, so that they know no limitation, and has enhanced physical strength and so forth, and compartmentalized mind, where a personality can come forward that acts and behaves like a super soldier. So this is what Randy Kramer says he went through, and then he went through this recruitment into this secret space program. He described it as the Mars Defense Force, taken to the moon, then travels to Mars by a spacecraft. This was 11 years after Randy Kramer says that he travelled to Mars by a jump gate. And so he's on Mars for 17 years, then he begins service on a spacecraft carrier, 2007, completes his tour of duty, comes back, age regression, sent back in time, and then lives the 20 years again as an ordinary civilian. Corey Good, same thing, very similar to Randy Kramer, actually very similar ages. He's part of a MyLab program, military abduction program at age 6. He's in that for about 10, 11 years. Then in 1986, he's taken from home, he's physically enhanced, which takes several months, and he turns 17 at some point. He's taken to the moon. There's a base on the moon called Lunar Operations Command, which was a former Nazi base, but was basically incorporated by the US military-industrial complex to become Lunar Operations Command. So he begins a tour of duty with Solar Warden, which is the name of the Navy's secret space program, and serves on other secret space programs as an intuitive empath through that time period. In 2007, he completes his tour of duty, again goes through this age regression. He describes it as a technology that takes about 2 to 3 weeks where you're physically immobilized, you can't move, drugs are put into you, some sort of chemicals are injected into you, and then you are physically age regressed. This is what Bill Tompkins said that he worked on at TRW from 1967 to 1971. So Tompkins worked on this age regression technology 67 to 71, and here we have with these 3 whistleblowers examples of people who have gone through a similar process of where they're physically immobilized for 2-3 weeks, injected with all sorts of medical pharmaceutical products. They're physically age regressed, and then they're sent back in time, and then they live that 20 years again. So more information about each of those whistleblowers and the timelines and so forth is in the book Insiders Reveal Secret Space Programs. So now we get to, I think, the interesting part for all of you, which is going to be, well, what's Australia's role in all of this? So far we've been hearing about the US. Well, does Australia have a role in this? So let's listen to what Corey Good has to say about Australia's role in the secret space program. He mentioned Australia being involved in the lower secret space programs. So that's what I was talking about earlier with the TR-3B operating out of Area 51, and that the National Reconnaissance Office and the US Air Force Space Command, that they have these space stations out in near-Earth orbit. That is what Corey Good describes as the lower level secret space program, the tiers of a cake, kind of like a layered cake, that there are different layers. At the very top you have you have NASA, what we see at the top of the cake. The next layer down is what the National Reconnaissance Office and the US Air Force Space Command, what they have running. So Corey is saying that Australia is involved in that level as well. So they're working, that the Australian branches of the Australian military, the aerospace industry, are working at that level as well with the various components of the US military industrial complex. And then you go to that next layer, the deeper layer, which is what I've been talking about, the US Navy, with the space battle groups, that Australian personnel work on that, and that Australians are involved also in all the different aspects of that, involving the design and the construction as well. So there's another whistleblower who can give us a little more information about Australia's role in the secret space programs. Stan Deyo was trained as an aerospace engineer and research physicist, and spent 3 years at US Air Force Academy from 1962 to 1964, while covertly trained in electrogravitics. So he has a very unusual story because while he was doing his conventional training to be a pilot with the US Air Force, he was also put through this covert training to be a specialist or an engineer in electrogravitics. And he will describe a little bit about that because I do have a little clip with him talking about that. And he gives us a little bit more information about Australia's role in the secret space program. Now, before I play the clip, what Deyo also says is that after he didn't finish his training with the US Air Force Academy, there's a story to that, what happened. Seems to have been some kind of mind control used to basically get him and some others to flunk on purpose the Air Force Air Force Academy. So it's an interesting story, but that's something you can read online if you wanted to follow up on Stan Deyo's testimony. This man, Edward Teller, is someone that is very important to the secret space programs. Deyo says that Teller is the one that was in charge of the program that he was involved in, or that he had knowledge about while in the United States. The interesting thing about Teller was that Teller, as many of you well know, is the so-called father of the hydrogen bomb, the most powerful atomic weapon that is publicly known. He also is a specialist, obviously, in nuclear technologies, and so he was the one, for example, one of the people involved in being able to develop nuclear engines for the TR-3B. We talked earlier about the TR-3B having this weight cancellation technologies, the spinning plasma at 60,000 RPM. Well, it also had nuclear engines that would give it the propulsion, because now the craft only had 3% of its normal weight. So that propulsion that the atomic engines supplied was incredible. Teller was involved in that. So this is what Deyo is saying, and we know that from another whistleblower, Bob Lazar, who said that it was William Teller that recruited him, or Edward Teller that recruited him to the Area 51 projects involving flying saucers. So Teller's name is involved because he's a key figure. Now, Deyo says that what happened to him was he had to leave the United States because he was involved in some espionage in terms of finding out what corporations were doing when it came to anti-gravity technology. This seemed to be part of the training that he had received, because he was supposed to find out which corporations were doing what when it came to anti-gravity. So he was an FBI agent. So he's a former Air Force Academy student, then he becomes a nuclear physicist, but he's also doubling as an FBI agent. He gets outed, and so he has to flee to Australia to basically escape retribution by those that had told him certain things. Now, one of the things that he says was that he was given letters of introduction to the Aeronautical Research Laboratory, which was located at the time in Melbourne. He was given letters of introduction that would basically enable him to work in an anti-gravity program that was being conducted there at the Aeronautical Research Laboratory in Melbourne, and that he was given special visa priority by the Australian consulate as part of Maxwell's party. So there's one of two letters he has in a book that documents that this scientist, J.R. Maxwell Field, had written letters of recommendation on behalf of Teller to the Aeronautical Research Laboratory so that they would employ Teller on an area of mutual interest. He kind of referred to it in that kind of roundabout way. But what Deyo makes clear is that that area of interest was actually anti-gravity research, that this was being conducted in Melbourne back in 1971, and that the Australian consulate in San Francisco was aware of this. So you not only have the Aeronautical Research Laboratory doing this, but it was also involving the Australian government, had high-level knowledge of this. So he identified Dr. Tom Keeble, who was head of mechanical engineering at the Aeronautical Research Laboratory, about these anti-gravity designs, and he said he saw one of these anti-gravity craft in Melbourne. That he saw it there, and there's Deo's reproduction of what he saw of an electrogravity craft in the assembly area at the Aeronautical Research Laboratory. So here you have documents supplied by Deo saying that Australia back in the early 1970s was involved in developing this anti-gravity craft. Another interesting Australian connection is Admiral Rico Botta, the person who was in charge of the debriefing of the 29 spies that were bringing back all this information about the German secret anti-gravity projects. It turns out Admiral Rico Botta was born in Melbourne. He's an Australian. And 18 years old, after having completed or having done some studies at the Melbourne School of Engineering, he travelled to the United States and then enlisted in the US Navy. So interesting that the Admiral, one of the key people in charge of setting up, and there's more to his involvement after the Second World War, where he was actually involved in helping the Navy set up this secret space program, that this is an Australian. He's an Australian, and so Australia is an interesting connection to the whole secret space programs. That Australia, at this facility, the Aeronautical Research Laboratories at Fisherman's Bend, that's how it looked back in 1970, that anti-gravity research was being conducted there, and that Deo says that he saw an anti-gravity craft that was built there, so that he saw one, that this was something that had actually become a prototype had been built. So that leads to the question, well, does that mean that some of these famous flying saucer incidents in Australia may actually be the testing or the operations of these secret spacecraft that had been built by the Australians with the cooperation of the US? Well, could the 1966 flying saucer incident be one? Well, there's a number of things about it that I think suggest that it may have actually been a prototype or a test of one of these Australian-built flying saucers. I think one of the interesting things is that a day before the incident. So I'll kind of wrap it up so that way we can have 15 minutes or so for questions. So I think that there is a deliberate policy to have this information revealed now. Information is coming out at an accelerating rate. I mean, personally, I first learned about this extensive secret space program from Randy Kramer back in 2014. He approached me and said, I've got this story to share, and he shared it, and we did some interviews, and I put them out, and his story has become more widely known now, where, as I said, he says that he spent 17 years on Mars and was part of this secret space program, where he was recruited by a special section of the US Marine Corps, which Tompkins actually confirms that the US Marine Corps actually has played a critical role as a kind of preserver of the kind of constitutional foundations of the way in which these secret space programs are conducted. So Tompkins has offered qualified support for some of what Kramer has said. Of course, we know about Corey Goode, talked about him at some length earlier. he says that he's also been encouraged to come forward by an alliance of the Secret Space Program Alliance, which, according to Corey, the Secret Space Program Alliance is a fusion of the Solar Warden program run by the Navy with a number of other space programs representing different groups who have defected from others. There are other programs, including defections from the Nazi program, which over the years became known as the Dark Fleet. So that the space program that the Nazis had developed in Antarctica, that was then expanded in an extensive set of agreements with the US military-industrial complex, became known as the Dark Fleet. That, according to Corey, that elements of that have broken away and defected and have joined with the Navy to form this Secret Space Program Alliance. And that Corey has been encouraged to come forward and reveal what he knows about this. So he's also been part of a kind of authorized disclosure program. And then we have Bill Tompkins, and at the back of his book, Selected by Extraterrestrials, he talks about this Admiral Hugh Webster, who was a corporate director of this Navy League organization after retirement, and that Admiral Webster had given Tompkins the go-ahead to reveal everything. Back in 2001, Tompkins went to this Admiral and said, look, these are the things I experienced. He had a kind of rough draft of what he experienced, and he was told by Webster, go out there, tell everything. Yeah, so thank you for that. It's a good way to finish.
Replicators.